Few images in martial history carry as much weight as a highly skilled warrior fighting with a full-length sword in each hand. It's a staple of fantasy literature and role-playing games, as well as Hollywood fight choreography, the kind of striking visual that immediately signals a fighter of extraordinary skill and daring. But how much of this image is rooted in actual historical practice? Surprisingly, the answer turns out to be more complicated and more interesting than most people assume. Dual-wielding swords, or fighting with two-bladed weapons simultaneously, does have a genuine historical footprint. That said, it looks very different from the spinning, acrobatic displays we've come to expect from popular media. The real tradition is grounded in pragmatism, regional martial culture, and the hard realities of armed combat across centuries and continents. Understanding what dual wielding actually meant in historical context requires looking beyond the modern image. It means examining period fight manuals, archaeological evidence, surviving martial traditions, and the tactical circumstances under which carrying two blades made sense. It also means separating the genuine martial applications from the centuries of myth-making that have accumulated around the concept. What emerges is a picture of a practice that was real, documented, and sometimes highly effective, but also situational, physically demanding, and very rare. The most well-documented European tradition of dual wielding involves a small light sword paired with a secondary weapon held in the offhand, most commonly a parrying dagger. This pairing became especially prevalent roughly from the late 15th through the 17th centuries. Italian and Spanish fencing masters wrote extensively about this combination, and their treatises survive in significant numbers. Achille Marozzo, writing in his 1536 treatise Opera Nova, devoted considerable attention to fighting with a sword in each hand. He described techniques for using dual swords, treating it as a legitimate if specialized branch of swordsmanship. His contemporary, Antonio Manciolino, similarly included two sword techniques in his own manual published just 5 years earlier. These were respected masters operating within established fencing traditions in Bologna, one of the major centers of European martial arts instruction. Later German masters also addressed the use of a sword in each hand, further confirming that dual wielding had genuine currency across multiple European fencing traditions during this period. It's worth noting that fighting with two full-length swords was considerably rarer than the sword and dagger setup, and the physical demands were significant. Wielding two weapons of equal length and weight requires considerable strength, coordination, and ambidexterity that most fighters simply didn't possess or didn't need to develop. The sword and dagger approach was popular precisely because it was practical. It gave fighters a defensive advantage without the extreme physical requirements of managing two swords. The more common sword and dagger combination also served a very clear tactical purpose. The dagger wasn't just a backup weapon. It functioned as a defensive tool, used to parry, trap, and redirect an opponent's blade while the sword handled offensive thrusts. Some daggers were even designed specifically for this purpose, featuring wide guards or blade-catching notches that made them more effective at controlling an incoming sword. Perhaps no historical figure is more closely associated with dual wielding than Miyamoto Musashi, the legendary Japanese swordsman who lived from around 1584 to 1645. Musashi founded the Niten Ichi-ryu school of swordsmanship, which translates roughly to the school of two heavens as one. His approach involved wielding a katana in one hand and a shorter wakizashi in the other, and he wrote about this method extensively in his famous work, The Book of Five Rings. Musashi's rationale for dual wielding was characteristically direct. He argued that a warrior should learn to use a sword effectively in one hand, since there were situations in combat where two-handed grips were impractical. Training with two swords simultaneously was, in his view, a way to build the strength and independence of each arm. He also emphasized the tactical advantage of having a second weapon available for simultaneous attack and defense. The shorter wakizashi could be used to control or block an opponent's blade, while the katana delivered the decisive strike. This created a dynamic where the fighter could manage both offense and defense without retreating. However, it's important to understand Musashi's approach in its proper context. Nitanichi Ryu wasn't simply about flashy two-sword combat performed for its own sake. Many of its kata, or formal practice sequences, actually involve only a single sword. The dual-wielding component was part of a broader philosophy of adaptability and martial completeness. Musashi himself reportedly used a variety of weapons and approaches throughout his famous dueling career. Above all, his school taught students to be effective with one sword, two swords, or whatever was at hand. For all the documented traditions that exist, it's crucial to acknowledge why dual wielding never became the dominant mode of sword combat in any culture. The reasons are overwhelmingly practical. First, a shield provides far superior protection to a second sword. Throughout most of military history, the sword and shield combination was the standard battlefield pairing for anyone going into combat with a blade. This is because a shield can absorb and deflect attacks in ways that a parrying blade simply cannot match. Second, many of the most effective swords in history, from the European longsword to the Japanese katana, were designed for two-handed use. A two-handed grip provides greater leverage, more powerful cuts, and better control than single-handed wielding. There's also the significant issue of training time and physical aptitude. Developing genuine ambidextrous fighting ability requires far more training than learning to fight competently with a single weapon and a shield. Most soldiers throughout history were not professional martial artists with years of dedicated practice. They were conscripts, militia members, or warriors with limited training time. For these fighters, a shield was intuitive and immediately useful in a way that a second sword was not. Further, even for professional soldiers such as samurai, their time was likely better spent developing their archery ability or other martial skills. And that's where I need to circle back to Musashi for a moment and give some context to his life. While he was born in an era of extreme conflict, by the time he developed his martial arts philosophy and swordsmanship school, Japan was unified and at peace. While he is believed to have taken part in the final battles of the unification of Japan, he was in his youth, and this wasn't what he was known for. He was a duelist who taught swordsmanship to a class of warriors who no longer had any legitimate battles to fight against other armies. He had the luxury of developing his dual-wielding technique because battlefield skills like archery were less relevant than ever. Had he been born 50 years prior, Musashi may have stuck to developing more conventional martial arts, though admittedly, that's simply speculation on my part. The historical record makes clear that dual-wielding sword techniques weren't invented by novelists or game designers. Real warriors in multiple cultures, across multiple centuries, developed and refined methods of fighting with two blades. Italian fencing masters wrote detailed instructions for it. Miyamoto Musashi built an entire school of swordsmanship around it. But the record also makes clear that dual wielding was always a specialist's art, never the default approach to armed combat. It required exceptional skill, specific tactical circumstances, and usually the absence of better defensive options like shields or armor. The warriors who practiced it were typically elite fighters operating in particular contexts, not rank-and-file soldiers on open battlefields. It thrived in the spaces such as duels and in personal defense, in the kinds of close encounters where agility and versatility mattered more than rigid formation discipline. What's fascinating is how the historical reality, while less dramatic than fiction, is arguably more impressive. The real dual wielders of history didn't rely on superhuman reflexes. They developed their skills through rigorous training and a deep understanding of the mechanics of armed combat. The 12th century was not a comfortable time for Christian Europe. The Crusader states in the Holy Land were under constant siege, and the forces of Islam seemed to be closing in from every direction. It's in this atmosphere of deep fear and desperate hope that one of the most enduring legends of the Middle Ages took root. This was the story of Prester John, a fabulously wealthy Christian king, said to rule a powerful empire somewhere in the distant East. And it's within this legend that we find one of history's most curious disappearances, that of a man known only as Master Philip. He was a papal physician who sailed from Venice in 1177 on a mission to find Prester John and was never heard from again. To understand why Philip's journey mattered so much, we first need to understand how desperately Europe wanted Prester John to be real. The legend had its earliest known appearance in 1145, when the German bishop Otto of Freising recorded something extraordinary in his chronicle. Otto claimed he'd met a Syrian bishop named Hugh of Jabala at the court of Pope Eugene III. Hugh told him about a certain John, a Christian priest and king ruling in the Far East, beyond Persia and Armenia. According to this account, John had recently defeated the Muslim rulers of Persia in a 3-day battle and conquered their capital. He'd then tried to march toward Jerusalem to aid the Crusaders, but the swollen waters of the Tigris forced him to turn back. Otto described this John as a Nestorian Christian, a member of an Eastern church that Rome considered heretical, but still recognizably Christian. For about 20 years after Otto's chronicle, references to Prester John largely disappeared. Then, around 1165, everything changed. A letter began circulating throughout Europe, supposedly written by Prester John himself, and addressed to the Eastern Roman Emperor Manuel Komnenos. It painted an astonishing picture of a kingdom beyond imagination, a land where no poverty existed and rivers ran with gold. To make his claims even more enticing, the author even claimed a fountain of perpetual youth could be found within his borders. He styled himself the most powerful ruler on earth, presiding over a domain of unimaginable wealth. This letter was the medieval equivalent of a bestseller. Over 100 different versions circulated across Europe in Latin, French, German, and Hebrew. Monks copied it, nobles treasured it, and people debated its claims for years. Modern scholars are virtually unanimous that it was a forgery written by a Western European. The tone, which addresses the emperor merely as a governor rather than by his imperial title, is something of a giveaway. Because of this, some historians have argued it may have originated as propaganda in the century after the Great Schism. Under this theory, Prester John, the theoretically most powerful Christian ruler in the world, had implicitly endorsed the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope over Orthodox Christianity. Despite its dubious origins, the letter clearly made an impression at the highest levels of the Catholic Church. Pope Alexander III, who had spent nearly 2 decades locked in a bitter struggle with Frederick Barbarossa and his rival anti-popes, took the notion of Prester John seriously. According to the papal letter itself, Alexander's personal physician, Master Philip, had recently returned from the Holy Land with remarkable news. While on pilgrimage, Philip claimed to have encountered representatives from Prester John's kingdom who said their ruler wished to embrace Roman Catholicism. This was exactly what Alexander wanted to hear. Having just been recognized as the legitimate pope at the Treaty of Venice in 1177, he saw an opportunity. On September 27th of that year, writing from the Rialto in Venice, he composed a letter addressed to the illustrious and magnificent King of the East. For much of history, it was unclear when this letter was actually written, but that problem was solved in modern times. The dating comes largely through the work of the 19th century German historian Friedrich Zarnke, who cross-referenced the date on one copy with the Venice location on another. He then examined Alexander's known movements to determine that 1177 was the only year the Pope had been in Venice on that particular date. Alexander's letter was carefully worded. He acknowledged hearing reports about the great Eastern King for some time. He expressed great pleasure at learning of Prester John's supposed desire for Catholic instruction. Interestingly, given the boastful nature of the initial letter, he included a gentle warning against boastfulness regarding wealth and power. The man chosen to deliver this letter was Master Philip himself. Described in the letter as Alexander's personal physician and servant, he was clearly someone the Pope trusted deeply. It wasn't the sort of mission one entrusted to just anyone, given the diplomatic sensitivity of the contents and the sheer uncertainty of the destination. And so Philip set out from Venice, carrying one of the most unusual diplomatic letters in history. He was bound for a kingdom no European had ever located, and that, as we now know, didn't exist at all. He sailed from Venice and vanished completely from the historical record. No chronicle notes his arrival anywhere, and no known return message was ever received. There's no account of his journey, nor has his ultimate fate ever surfaced. Master Philip simply and completely disappeared. There's a fascinating scholarly debate about whether Alexander had even read the original letter of Prester John before composing his response. Historians have noted that Alexander makes no direct reference to the letter's contents, except a brief reference to his boasting. Most importantly, he doesn't mention the fantastical claims beyond his claims of significant wealth. This has led some to suggest Alexander's letter wasn't a response to the Prester John letter at all, but a diplomatic overture based on what Philip had told him about encounters in the Holy Land. It's entirely possible Philip had met pilgrims from one of the remoter Christian communities of Central Asia while in Jerusalem. He may have interpreted their words through the lens of existing expectations about Prester John. Nestorian communities were known to exist across wide stretches of Asia at this time, and encounters with representatives of these distant churches in the Holy Land weren't unheard of. Notably, many of these Nestorian lands were deep within the heart of Central Asia, a highly difficult journey through hostile feuding tribes. As for Philip himself, the possibilities are numerous and none cheerful. Travel in the 12th century was extraordinarily dangerous. Disease, shipwreck, bandits, and simple navigational failure could have ended his journey at any point. He was heading into lands no European map could accurately depict, searching for a kingdom that existed only in the collective imagination of Christendom. Whether he perished at sea, succumbed to illness, or was slain in unfamiliar territory, we'll almost certainly never know. However, others have proposed more mundane explanations, which, given the lack of evidence, are essentially equally likely. While the records don't state clearly what Philip brought along with him on the journey, he would have necessarily carried fabulous offerings from the Pope. Some believe that he simply decided to retire in a Christian community in the Near East with his newfound wealth. There's also the idea that he may have simply turned around upon gathering more information in the Holy Land. He may have realized he wasn't properly equipped for a journey to the edge of China with the resources he had been given. He was also likely traveling with a fairly significant party, and if they didn't want to continue on, he would have had little choice but to return empty-handed. The apparent failure of Philip's mission didn't diminish the legend of Prester John in the slightest. The story simply adapted, as legends so often do. When the Mongols burst into Eastern Europe in the 13th century, the legend became entangled with reports of their conquests. A rumor spread after the Fifth Crusade in 1221 that a King David, supposedly the son or grandson of Prester John, had defeated enemy armies in Persia. By the 14th century, The presumed location of Prester John's kingdom had shifted entirely from Asia to Ethiopia. Europeans became aware of that country's status as an isolated Christian empire surrounded by Muslim neighbors. Portuguese explorers of the 15th and 16th centuries actively searched for Prester John along the African coast. In the end, they even engaged diplomatically with Ethiopia on the basis that Prester John had been a mistranslation of one of their previous emperor's names. Master Philip's disappearance is the perfect encapsulation of the entire Prester John phenomenon. Here was a real man, sent on a real mission, carrying a real letter, in search of something fundamentally unreal. His vanishing mirrors the legend itself, tantalizing, suggestive of something just beyond reach, and ultimately without resolution. Oxford in the 14th century wasn't the quaint university town people imagine today. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The University of Oxford had been conducting formal teaching since at least 1096 and had received its own royal charter in 1248. It held enormous power over the city thanks to a series of royal privileges stretching back decades, and scholars weren't ordinary citizens. They were classified as clergy under the protection of the church, which meant they answered to the university's chancellor rather than to civil authorities for most matters. This created a two-tiered system that deeply frustrated Oxford's townspeople, who watched scholars enjoy legal immunity, tax exemptions, and influence over local commerce. The resentment ran both ways. Students were often young, far from home, and prone to the kinds of trouble you'd expect from unsupervised young men living in a strange city. Records from medieval coroners' rolls show that scholars were involved in a staggering proportion of violent crimes in Oxford. Violent clashes between the so-called town and gown factions were practically routine. In 1209, the slaying of 2 scholars by local residents had been so brutal and violent that a group of fleeing academics went on to found the University of Cambridge. In 1314, a riot between rival student factions degenerated into what could be more accurately called a gang conflict, with dozens left dead. And in 1349, the Black Death had torn through Oxford, eliminating roughly a quarter of the university's lecturers and upending the city's economy. By February of 1355, Oxford was a city where tensions between students and locals had long reached their boiling point. On the 10th of February, 1355, the feast of Saint Scholastica, a group of university students walked into the Swindlestock Tavern right in the heart of the city. Among them were 2 clergymen, Walter de Springhouse and Roger de Chesterfield, both from parishes in the southwest of England. The tavern was a regular haunt for students, and it happened to be owned by John de Bereford, who also served as the mayor of Oxford. The students were served wine by the tavern's vintner, a man named John de Croydon, who was known to be a close associate of the mayor. They weren't impressed. They complained that the wine was poor quality and demanded something better. Croydon didn't take kindly to the criticism, and the exchange quickly turned heated. The confrontation escalated to the point where one of the students threw his cup of wine into Croydon's face. From there, things spiraled fast. Punches were thrown, more students and townspeople flooded in, and within half an hour, a full-scale brawl had erupted in the streets. The university's chancellor rushed to the scene and attempted to restore order, but he was driven back when townspeople fired arrows at him. The violence raged until nightfall, and that was only the beginning of the conflict that would follow. The next morning, the situation grew dramatically worse. Townspeople rang the bell of St. Martin's Church, a traditional signal to summon locals to arms. In response, students rang the bell of St. Mary's, the university's church, rallying scholars to defend themselves. Armed groups of townspeople, carrying bows, clubs, and improvised weapons, began hunting down students across the city's streets and parishes. Scholars barricaded themselves inside university halls and fought back from upper floors as if they were under siege. But the real devastation came when reinforcements arrived from the surrounding countryside. Villagers from rural communities outside Oxford poured into the city to support the townspeople, swelling their numbers to what some estimates place at over 1,000 combatants. These combined forces launched coordinated and brutal assaults on university buildings, breaking into student accommodations, ransacking property, and much worse. There were reports of scholars being scalped and their bodies desecrated, and students were found dead in the streets and floating in the river. When word of the chaos reached King Edward III, who was staying at nearby Woodstock, he issued a proclamation forbidding any further harm to scholars or their property. It didn't matter. The mob ignored the king's order and continued the violence through a second full day. By the evening of the third day, the rioters had finally exhausted themselves and began retreating to their homes or back into the countryside. They left behind a wrecked and bloodied city. Approximately 60 members of the university had been killed, along with around 30 townspeople. In the aftermath, Edward dispatched royal judges to Oxford to investigate and assign blame. Their findings were unambiguous. Despite evidence that the students had provoked the initial confrontation, the commission placed virtually all responsibility on the townspeople and the city's municipal authorities. Mayor John de Barrowford was stripped of his office and sent to a notoriously grim prison in London, and the town's bailiffs were jailed alongside him. Oxford itself was hit with a fine of 500 marks, a punishing sum at the time. Then, on the 27th of June, 1355, Edward issued a royal charter that fundamentally reshaped the balance of power in Oxford. The university's chancellor was granted the right to tax bread and ale sold in the town, and the authority to regulate weights and measures used in local commerce. He was also given broad oversight over Oxford's economic affairs, even beyond these significant concessions. The town lost its already limited power to take legal action in any case involving a scholar or the university. This effectively rendered municipal authorities subordinate to the chancellor's court in most matters of any significant consequence. Historians have noted that Edward resolved the matter with unusual speed for the time. This was likely because he couldn't afford spreading domestic instability while facing the prospect of renewed conflict with France and Scotland. But perhaps the most striking and long-lasting consequence of the riot wasn't legal or economic. It was ceremonial. Edward imposed an annual penance on the city of Oxford that would endure for nearly 500 years. Every year on St. Scholastica's Day, the mayor, the bailiffs, and numerous townspeople, one representing each slain scholar, were required to march to the university church. There, they attended a mass for the souls of the dead students and paid a fine of 63 pence, 1 penny per official victim. During these annual processions, students reportedly jeered and pelted the humiliated officials along the route. The penance continued in various forms for centuries, with Oxford's civic leaders repeatedly and fruitlessly petitioning the crown for relief from the humiliating ritual. Generation after generation of mayors endured it. It wasn't until 1825 that the tradition finally ended. The sitting mayor, Isaac Grubb, simply refused to participate in the humiliation ritual, and the university chose not to press the matter further. The riot's legacy cast a long shadow over Oxford's identity and its internal politics. While subsequent town and gown conflicts did occur over the following centuries, none came close to the scale or ferocity of the events of 1355. The St. Scholastica Day riot marked the last of the truly extreme bloody encounters between the two factions. Grievances were increasingly channeled through the courts or directed at the government, rather than settled in the streets with weapons. Still, the underlying tension between the university and the city it dominated never fully disappeared. It took 600 years for a formal act of reconciliation to take place. In 1955, on the precise anniversary of the riot, the city of Oxford awarded the university's vice-chancellor the honorary title of Freeman of the City. In return, the university conferred an honorary doctorate in civil law upon the sitting mayor. It was a symbolic gesture, but an important one, acknowledging that the wounds of 1355 had finally healed 600 years later. Around the 6th or 5th century BC, a man known as Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism and author of one of the most influential philosophical texts ever written, simply vanished. He supposedly climbed onto the back of a water buffalo and rode westward through a mountain pass. After that, he was never seen again. It's one of the great enigmatic exits in history, and scholars, mystics, and storytellers have been trying to make sense of it for over 2,000 years. The disappearance of Lao Tzu sits at the intersection of history, legend, and philosophy, and unpacking it means grappling with a figure who may have been mythological to begin with. Interestingly, some traditions even claim that this disappeared scholar and teacher would establish one of the world's major religious traditions after his journey to the West. Before we can talk about the disappearance, we need to talk about the man himself, and that's where things get complicated right away. The name Lao Tzu isn't really a personal name at all. It translates roughly to Old Master, and it may have functioned more as a title than as a name. The earliest substantial biographical account comes from Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian, written around 100 BC, several centuries after Lao Tzu supposedly lived. In that account, Sima Qian identifies Lao Tzu as Li Er, also known as Li Dan, who served as a keeper of the royal archives in the court of the Zhou dynasty. Even Sima Qian himself seemed uncertain about the details, noting that some people confused Lao Tzu with other historical figures. It's a rare and telling moment of historiographic humility from one of China's greatest chroniclers. Modern historians have long debated whether he was a single historical individual, a figure drawing on the lives and teachings of multiple philosophers, or a largely legendary creation. The Tao Te Ching, the foundational text attributed to him, shows evidence of having been compiled over time by multiple authors, which complicates the picture even further. Some researchers have argued that the text didn't reach its current form until the 4th or 3rd century BC, well after Lao Tzu's supposed lifetime. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that by the time the Tao Te Ching became widely circulated, the figure of Lao Tzu had already taken on a semi-mythological quality. The most famous account of Lao Tzu's disappearance is the story of his westward departure. According to the tradition recorded by Sima Qian in the Records of the Grand Historian, Lao Tzu grew disillusioned with the moral decay of the Zhou dynasty. He decided that his work couldn't repair the degeneracy he was witnessing, and his only solution was to leave civilization behind entirely. He traveled westward toward the frontier, and when he reached the Hangu Pass, the guardian of the pass recognized him as a sage of extraordinary insight. According to this tradition, this gate guard wouldn't let him pass without recording his wisdom, and the result was the Tao Te Ching. This text, comprising roughly 5,000 characters, would go on to become one of the most translated works in human history. After completing the text, Lao Tzu continued west and vanished from the historical record entirely. This story has all the hallmarks of a founding myth: the reluctant sage, the last-minute transmission of sacred knowledge, the enigmatic departure into the unknown. It's a powerful narrative, and it clearly served important purposes for the Taoist tradition. By placing the composition of the Tao Te Ching at the moment of Lao Tzu's departure, The story frames the text as a kind of farewell gift. It was a distillation of ultimate wisdom offered at the threshold between civilization and the wild. The westward direction is significant too. In Chinese cosmology, the West was associated with death, decline, and the setting sun. But it wasn't all negative, and it was also associated with transcendence and the realm beyond ordinary human experience. The Hangu Pass itself, situated in what is now Henan Province, became a site of pilgrimage and reverence in later centuries. It was treated as a sacred threshold between the known world and whatever lay beyond it to Taoists. Scholars and religious traditions have offered a range of explanations for what happened to Laozi after he passed through the pass. One of the most controversial theories is the so-called conversion of the barbarians theory, which emerged during the rivalry between Buddhism and Taoism in medieval China. This theory, elaborated in a text called the Huahu Jing, claimed that Laozi traveled to India after leaving China. From there, it's claimed that he either became the Buddha himself or served as the Buddha's teacher. The idea was that Buddhism was really just a foreign offshoot of Taoism, tailored by Laozi for a less sophisticated audience. In the Chinese worldview of the time, all the world was subordinate to China in terms of knowledge and sophistication. This theory was politically charged and was used as a weapon in sectarian disputes for centuries. It also allowed Chinese scholars to get around the sticky fact that one of the most influential religious and philosophical systems was of non-Chinese origin. This challenged the idea that Chinese thought and ideas were superior to all forms of barbarian teachings. By claiming Laozi as either the Buddha himself or his teacher, Buddhism was ultimately reclaimed as a Chinese system viewed through a foreign lens. It also allowed the proponents of Buddhism in China to synthesize various Chinese traditions, including Taoism, together with Buddhism. This idea was extremely controversial and officially condemned at times, and the Huahu Jing was ordered destroyed by imperial decree on multiple occasions. It was most notably destroyed during the Yuan dynasty, who were the Mongol rulers that had an extremely strong connection to a highly conservative form of Buddhism. Despite these attempts, partial copies survived in various forms, though no complete copy has ever been discovered. Other traditions within Taoism took a much more mystical approach, viewing the disappearance as a kind of deification ritual. Rather than traveling to any specific earthly destination, Laozi was said to have achieved a kind of ultimate transcendence, merging with the Tao itself. In later Taoist religious movements, particularly the Celestial Masters tradition that developed in the 2nd century, Laozi was deified as the Supreme Old Lord. In this school of thought, he became one of the highest deities in the Taoist pantheon. From this perspective, the disappearance was actually an ascension. It was a return to the cosmic source from which all things emerge, and from which he could further guide the world. In this tradition, he wasn't abandoning civilization because it couldn't be fixed, but rather because he realized his work on Earth had drawn to a close. This deification process transformed Laozi from a historical philosopher into a cosmic figure believed to have manifested multiple times throughout history. This interpretation would allow Taoists to syncretize with other religious movements extremely well, since any wise historical figure could simply be a manifestation of Laozi. For historians working outside the religious tradition, you probably won't be surprised to find that the explanations tend to be more prosaic. Some scholars have suggested that if Laozi was a real individual, he likely simply retired from public life and died in obscurity, as many people did in the ancient world. The westward journey may have been a later embellishment added to explain why there was no tomb, no death record, and no further mention of him in contemporaneous sources. Others have proposed that Laozi might have traveled to regions outside the Zhou cultural sphere, perhaps to areas that are now part of Central Asia. If this is true, he lived out his remaining years among peoples who didn't keep the kinds of records that would have preserved his story. The absence of any archaeological evidence connected to Laozi is noteworthy but not necessarily surprising. The ancient world was vast and record-keeping was uneven. Plenty of significant historical figures left little or no material trace, and that doesn't necessarily render him ahistorical. What's more revealing is that even in the centuries immediately following his supposed lifetime, Chinese writers were already uncertain about who he was and what had happened to him. The Zhuangzi, another foundational Taoist text attributed to the philosopher Zhuangzhou, includes several anecdotes about Laozi. However, it treats him in ways that blur the line between historical figure and literary device. This suggests that if there was a historical Laozi, the process of mythologizing him began remarkably early in the development of Chinese thought. Perhaps what's most interesting about Laozi's disappearance is how perfectly it aligns with the philosophy attributed to him. The Tao Te Ching is a text deeply concerned with the virtue of withdrawal, with emptiness, with the power of absence and the limitations of fixed identity. A sage who simply vanishes, leaving behind only his words, is the ultimate embodiment of the principles the text espouses. The Tao Te Ching teaches that the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao, and a founder who can be pinned down, located, and defined wouldn't quite fit that ethos. In a tradition that prizes the ephemeral nature of the world, the founder's refusal to remain present is itself a kind of profound and enduring teaching. Whether Laozi was a real man who walked west into the mountains or a composite of several thinkers whose legacy crystallized into a single mythic figure will never be known. The empty space he left behind has been filled with theology, philosophy, political argument, and storytelling for millennia. And in a way, that's the most Taoist outcome imaginable. The sage vanishes, and in his absence, the world finds an inexhaustible source of contemplation and wonder. Hey friends, it's Jimmy here with my usual quick reminder to hit the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Now with that said, let's get into some truly fascinating historical mysteries. In ancient Greece, high on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, a mysterious woman sat in a dark chamber and spoke with the voice of a god. Shrouded in sweet-smelling fumes and holding sacred laurel leaves, the Oracle of Delphi would fall into an otherworldly trance. She would then deliver cryptic prophecies that could sway the fate of kingdoms. Was the Pythia, Delphi's famous priestess, truly channeling Apollo's divine spirit, or were more earthly forces behind her visions? This question has captivated scholars and scientists for centuries, and the truth likely lies somewhere between myth, botany, and geology. For over 1,000 years, people from across the ancient world trekked to Delphi to seek guidance from the Pythia. No major decision, whether to wage conflict or establish a new colony, was made without consulting this oracle, whose words were believed to carry the wisdom of Apollo. The Greeks believed that during her prophetic trance, Apollo's spirit took over the Pythia's body, changing her voice and filling her with divine frenzy. Ancient observers like the geographer Strabo and the historian Plutarch noted that the priestess's inspiration came from a mysterious vapor rising from a chasm beneath Apollo's temple. While the Pythia's prophetic gift was revered as a miracle, modern researchers have hunted for a more scientific explanation. According to legend, the prophetic powers of Delphi were discovered by chance. A shepherd named Caritas noticed his goats acting strangely near a fissure on Mount Parnassus. When he drew close, he was suddenly overcome by visions in the voice of Apollo. The spot was declared holy, and a woman was appointed as the first Pythia to sit on a tripod over that fissure and channel the god's voice. Ever after, Each oracle day began with the sacrifice of a goat to ensure Apollo's favor, before the priestess took her seat for the trance. In ancient times, the Pythia's ritual prior to communing with Apollo followed an extremely strict routine. She purified herself in the sacred spring and likely sipped its waters. She burned offerings of barley and laurel leaves, and she chewed on Apollo's sacred bay laurel. Thus prepared, she would descend into the temple's inner sanctum, known as the Adyton, that lay below the main floor. There, seated on a high three-legged tripod above the hidden chasm in the earth, the priestess inhaled whatever vapors emerged while she fell into her trance. Only the temple staff could peer into the depths, and petitioners stood just outside, listening as the Pythia's voice, distorted by the trance, issued from the darkness. Her utterances were often cryptic and raw. Temple priests sometimes later shaped her words into poetic verses before relaying Apollo's message to those waiting. To the awestruck visitors, it truly seemed that a mere mortal had been filled with the spirit of a god. For a long time, scholars dismissed the idea that the Pythia's trance had any physical cause. When early 20th century excavators failed to find a cleft or fumes at the site, influential experts argued that the ancient stories of intoxicating vapors were mere folklore. They suggested the oracle's state was a form theater rather than chemistry. This skepticism prevailed for decades, until a fresh scientific investigation in the 1990s turned the tide. A multidisciplinary team led by a geologist found that two tectonic fault lines intersect directly beneath the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. The surrounding bedrock is rich in petrochemical deposits, and seismic activity along the faults could have released underground gases right into the temple's closed inner chamber. Tests of spring water near the temple revealed traces of light hydrocarbons, notably methane, ethane, and ethylene, that matched the types of fumes ancient writers had hinted at. Ethylene was a particularly compelling find. This gas has a sweet odor, and Plutarch noted the Delphi vapors smelled like perfume. Further, it's known to induce euphoria and hallucinations in low to moderate doses. Even the more frightening aspects of the Delphic trance can be explained by this geology. Plutarch observed that usually the Pythia's trance was peaceful, but on rare occasions she would erupt in wild convulsions, shrieking incoherently, and such a delirium once proved fatal. Modern toxicologists note that inhaling hydrocarbon gases can indeed produce both scenarios. Most subjects experience a manageable out-of-body trance, but in certain individuals the same dosage can be fatal. It appears that Delphi's priestesses were, quite literally, getting high on natural petrochemical fumes seeping from the earth. This scientific detective work has lent credence to what the ancients claimed all along. Plutarch himself noted that by the 1st century AD, the once robust vapors were growing weak. He stated that this caused the oracle's powers to wane, which is exactly what we would expect if the geological source had begun to run dry. Some scholars have proposed that the Pythia may have actually been chewing oleander, a highly toxic plant that can cause symptoms like disorientation, tremors, and seizure-like episodes. This theory argues that by chewing oleander leaves or inhaling their smoke from a brazier, the priestess could induce a delirious, trance-like state chemically, akin to an epileptic episode. Oleander poisoning can very easily be lethal, so if this was part of the ritual, it would have required careful dosing. This could perhaps explain why the Pythia only operated on specific days under controlled conditions. Some have even speculated that a combination of oleander's toxins and ethylene gas might have jointly contributed to the oracle's trance. Beyond any specific gas or herb, the power of the oracle's trance also drew on psychology and ritual. The Pythia underwent lifelong training and purification to become a worthy vessel for Apollo. The intense ceremony, expectation, and spiritual focus likely put her in an altered state of consciousness even before any fumes took effect. Plutarch himself believed that the physical vapors were merely a trigger, and that the true source of prophecy was the inspiration and disciplined trance of the priestess herself. In this sense, the oracle's ability to deliver profound messages may have arisen from a perfect synergy of natural geology, substances, and deep religious training. Still others believe that ultimately it was just a theatrical performance designed to trick credulous Greeks who were taught from birth to treat the Pythia's words as divine. While most believe that this element was at play, the fact that the oracle was an institution for centuries upon centuries seems to run counter to this modern narrative. Thousands of years later, the Oracle of Delphi remains a spellbinding example of how myth and science can intertwine. Even after the oracle was silenced in the 4th century, the story of the Pythia's trance continues to captivate our imagination well over a millennium later. Picture a thriving city under siege. Athens in 430 BC, its streets packed with refugees and soldiers, when suddenly an invisible stalker struck. Within weeks, tens of thousands of Athenians, perhaps a quarter to one-third of the population, were dead or dying. This nightmare epidemic, known as the Plague of Athens, erupted amidst the Peloponnesian War and became one of history's earliest recorded plagues. It not only decimated the city's people, but also altered the course of the conflict and Athenian society, as vividly described by the historian Thucydides, who lived through it. Almost overnight, the once vibrant metropolis was transformed into a nightmare. Corpses lay unburied in the streets and even in the temples, and the city's finest doctors stood helpless as the mysterious sickness defied every remedy. In the spring of 430 BC, a strange illness first appeared in Piraeus, the bustling harbor of Athens. Thucydides recorded that people in good health were suddenly seized by severe fever and throat inflammation, an alarming new sickness with no obvious cause. The disease spread rapidly from the port into the city's dense urban population. Panicked Athenians even suspected the Spartans of poisoning the wells at Piraeus in a desperate attempt to explain the sudden calamity. Once inside the walls, the plague raced through Athens unchecked. Packed side by side, residents infected one another quickly. Few households were spared from the terror. The Spartans besieging the city, camped outside, didn't fall ill on the same scale, which only deepened the Athenians' despair and paranoia. Those stricken experienced horrific symptoms unlike anything doctors had seen. The illness began with sudden high fever, red eyes, and violent coughing fits. It then attacked the stomach with ceaseless vomiting and painful cramps. Many victims broke out in a red rash with small pustules, accompanied by an unquenchable thirst. In their agony, sufferers couldn't bear even light clothing and would plunge into water to cool their burning bodies. Most died by about a week in, often succumbing to severe diarrhea and total exhaustion as their bodies failed. A few did survive. Thucydides was among them, and those survivors gained immunity, rarely falling ill twice. They became crucial caregivers for others. However, survival often came at a price. Some recovered only to suffer lasting damage like blindness, lost extremities, or even memory loss. The plague's toll was measured not only in lives lost, but in lifelong debilitation for many who lived through it. As the death toll mounted, social order in Athens collapsed. The sudden deaths of even strong, healthy people caused widespread despair. Many who realized they were getting sick lost all hope and simply resigned themselves to fate. In the lawlessness that ensued, Citizens began to ignore laws and customs. No one feared punishment when plague death seemed more imminent than any court sentence. Property and social hierarchy were upended, and some poor Athenians suddenly gained wealth by appropriating the estates of the dead. Many people lived only for the moment, seeking pleasure while they could in ways that horrified ancient writers. Religious faith also faltered. The plague struck pious and impious alike, causing many to question the gods' protection. Some thought the disaster was divine punishment, or the fulfillment of an oracle that warned a pestilence would come during a conflict with Sparta. Funeral rites broke down. There were too many dead for traditional burials. Corpses were hastily piled into mass graves or burned together without ceremony. Meanwhile, medicine was helpless. Doctors quickly caught the illness and died alongside their patients. No remedy or prayer could cure the unknown disease. Only those few survivors with immunity could safely tend to others as the chaos spread. Among the dead was Athens' leading statesman Pericles, who succumbed to the illness in 429 BC. Thucydides observed that many wealthy citizens had died, and their fortunes were inherited by distant relatives of lower status, subtly shifting social hierarchies in Athens. The epidemic also weakened Athens militarily. So many soldiers and sailors were lost that the city's war effort faltered, tipping the balance in Sparta's favor. Ever the rational observer, Thucydides meticulously documented the plague's symptoms and progression. He hoped that his record would allow future generations to recognize the disease if it ever struck again. Yet despite this detailed account, he couldn't identify the disease behind the outbreak, and for over 2 millennia, the illness remained a mystery. Scholars have proposed smallpox, measles, bubonic plague, typhus, and other candidates, but no consensus exists since the symptoms recorded could fit many ailments. A major clue emerged in 2006 when researchers applied genetic analysis to ancient remains. In a mass grave of plague victims, scientists found traces of the bacterium that causes typhoid fever. This finding strongly suggests the plague of Athens was an explosive outbreak of typhoid fever. Typhoid spreads through contaminated water or food and causes prolonged fever, thirst, and diarrhea, closely matching the accounts of the epidemic in the crowded, unsanitary city. Some experts remain skeptical, noting that typhoid fever would have been too familiar to Greeks to be described as a mysterious new plague. Among alternate theories, smallpox is often highlighted. It produces a high fever and pustular rash and can decimate an unexposed population with around 30% mortality. However, the smallpox theory has shortcomings too, since Thucydides didn't mention the telltale back pain or pockmark scars typical of smallpox survivors. Further, it was also quite well known to the Athenians, so again the idea that it was described as a new outbreak is questionable. To this day, the exact cause of the plague of Athens remains debated. The best evidence points to typhoid fever as the culprit, but definitive proof has been elusive. What is clear is that this was an epidemic where the disease struck a population with no prior exposure or immunity, which explains its catastrophic impact on Athens. Picture a medieval harbor at dawn. Caravans from the interior unload silk and spices on the docks. Fishermen haul in the morning's catch, and the call to prayer echoes from a brick minaret over the bustling bazaar. This was Abiskun at its height, a prosperous port city on the Caspian Sea where merchants and sailors from many lands converged. Yet just a few centuries later, this thriving city would vanish beneath rising waters, with its exact location becoming one of medieval Iran's great historical mysteries. Abiskun stood on the southern Caspian coast in what's now northern Iran, near the mouth of the Gorgan River. This strategic location made it a crossroads of regional trade in the Middle Ages. By the 10th century, Abaskun had grown into one of the most prosperous ports on the Caspian, renowned for its busy docks and thriving bazaars. Local craftsmen produced fine leather, woolen cloth, and dried fish, while traders dealt in these wares alongside luxurious bird feathers used to decorate garments. The port connected Persian civilization with distant lands via the Caspian Sea. Through these routes, Abaskun linked the Silk Road's overland caravans with maritime trade, allowing a rich exchange of products and culture. But its very connectedness also exposed the city to dangers from afar. One dramatic chapter in Abaskun's history came with invaders from the far north, the Vikings who sailed down into the Caspian Sea. In 910, Norse marauders stormed Abaskun and nearby towns, seizing treasure and captives until local fighters rallied and finally drove them off. A few years later, an even larger Viking fleet returned to ravage Abaskun's coast and extract a massive payment from the poorly defended merchants. For Abaskun's inhabitants, unaccustomed to seaborne invaders, the sight of these marauders was a terrifying shock. Despite these violent incursions, the Vikings had no desire to destroy this golden goose, and the city recovered and continued trading for a time. However, the troubles were not over, and the next great threat would arrive from a different direction entirely. In 1220, the Shah of the Khwarezmian Empire, a realm that spanned Persia and Central Asia, arrived on Abaskun's shore as a desperate fugitive. He was fleeing from the Mongol armies of Genghis Khan. According to chronicles, the defeated Shah took refuge on a small island near Abaskun's coast. This was likely one of the swampy barrier isles in the southeastern Caspian. There, within sight of Abaskun's harbor, the exiled monarch succumbed to illness and died, ending the Khwarezmian royal line on a forlorn Caspian sandbar. Some believe that the Mongol forces razed the city at that time, though the historical records are unclear. Whatever the case, the city did rebuild following the Mongol invasion. In the decades that followed the fugitive Shah's demise, Abaskun's fate was sealed not by Mongol swords or any human invader, but by the sea itself. By the mid-14th century, geographers noted that Abaskun had been submerged by the rising Caspian Sea. The Caspian has a history of unpredictable water level swings, and around this time its waters suddenly swelled. Medieval accounts explain that the mighty Oxus River, or Amu Darya in modern terms, temporarily changed course into the Caspian. This in turn flooded the coastal plain with an immense influx of water. Usually the Oxus flowed into the distant Aral Sea, so this diversion was an exceptional event that caused a dramatic rise in the Caspian's level. Abaskun, which had by then effectively turned into an island, was ultimately swamped by this deluge, and the city was literally washed off the map. The sea claimed everything: the harbor, the market, the homes, leaving nothing but water where a city had once stood. The catastrophe left such an impression that even centuries later, Abaskun was remembered as a missing Silk Road port, thought to lie beneath the Caspian's waves. With Abaskun lost underwater, explorers and archaeologists later searched for any trace of its ruins. In the 1930s, a Swedish archaeologist suggested that a ruin-rich site called Gumish Tepe could mark the location of Abaskun. Many researchers today consider this area a strong candidate for the lost port. Brick foundations and artifacts have been found there, but much of the site is still submerged, and no definitive excavation has yet confirmed it as Abaskun's resting place. The shoreline has shifted so much over the centuries that pinpointing the old harbor is difficult without further research. Imagine a city built almost entirely of wood, from its homes and shops to the sidewalks underfoot. Now picture that city after a rainless summer its timbers dry as tinder, when a spark hits at exactly the wrong place. In October 1871, that spark found Chicago, and within hours an inferno engulfed the metropolis. By the time the flames died out, a third of the city lay in ruins, and 100,000 people were left homeless. The Great Chicago Fire remains one of the most infamous urban disasters, a catastrophe so dramatic that its true story is often obscured by myth drilled into us in school as fact. On the night of Sunday, October 8, 1871, a fire began in a barn on the city's southwest side. The blaze likely started around 8:30 p.m., and within minutes it was out of control, fueled by dry fodder and driven by a fierce southwest wind toward the heart of the city. Initial firefighting efforts were hampered by exhaustion and confusion. The city's 185 firefighters had been battling blazes for days, and a reporting error sent crews to the wrong location at first. Meanwhile, flames raced through densely built wooden neighborhoods, leaping the Chicago River and igniting the downtown business district. By Monday morning, chaos ruled as residents fled for their lives. Many ran as far east as they could, onto the Lake Michigan shoreline, and even waded into the water to escape the relentless flames. Heat and updrafts spawned fire whirls, tornadoes of flame that lifted burning debris high into the sky. Blazing embers rained down to spark new fires, even leaping the river when some landed on a railroad car carrying kerosene on the far side. The fire roared northward through the night, consuming almost everything in its path in an unrelenting wall of flame. Early on October 10th, nature lent a hand. A much-needed rain began to fall, helping extinguish the last flames. By the time it was over, the fire had raged for 30 hours, killing an estimated 300 people and reducing 3.3 square miles of the city to ash. Some 17,000 buildings were destroyed, causing $200 million in damage and leaving 1 in 3 residents homeless, as entire neighborhoods vanished. Large portions of Chicago were now a smoldering wasteland of charred rubble and chimneys, as far as the eye could see. The exact cause of the Great Chicago Fire was never officially determined, though there is, of course, a story I assume the vast majority of you are already familiar with as historical fact. Popular legend blames a cow in Catherine O'Leary's barn, kicking over a lantern and starting the blaze. Mrs. O'Leary denied this story, and historians have cast doubt on the cow and lantern tale. It was an easy scapegoat, but no evidence ever proved the cow story true. Other theories suggest a neighbor's accident, or even a falling meteor could have sparked the blaze. In fact, other devastating fires erupted that same night around Lake Michigan, lending some credence to the meteor theory. Some scientists believe that this debris could have sparked a trail of fires when combined with the dry conditions. In truth, all we know is that the fire likely began in or around the O'Leary barn that night. Whether through human carelessness, bovine negligence, or a celestial object, a small flame caught hold and found perfect conditions to explode into a firestorm. Chicago in 1871 was a disaster waiting to happen. More than 2/3 of its structures were made of wood. Roofs were often covered in tar or wooden shingles, and even the sidewalks and roads were made of wood. After a nearly 3-month drought, the city was tinder dry. The day before, firefighters had battled a large blaze that left them exhausted and their equipment damaged. When the O'Leary barn ignited, Chicago's overtaxed firefighters were slow to respond due to confusion and faulty alarms. Under these conditions, even quote-unquote fireproof brick and stone buildings eventually ignited as their interiors baked from the extreme heat. It was a perfect storm of drought, wind, wooden buildings, and human error that conspired to turn a small barn fire into a citywide cataclysm for the ages. In the immediate aftermath, Stunned survivors wandered through the ruins as authorities struggled to maintain order. Reports of looting forced officials to summon militias, and martial law was declared for weeks. Relief efforts began at once. Aid poured in from across the country and overseas to help the 100,000 displaced residents. The British sent assistance. A donation from England helped establish Chicago's first free public library as a symbol of the city's rebirth. Fortunately, key infrastructure such as railroads and stockyards lay outside the burn zone and continued to function, so the city's economic lifeline survived to fuel the recovery. Rebuilding began immediately. Within weeks, Chicago elected a new mayor who pushed for stricter building codes and fire safety measures. The city soon passed regulations requiring fireproof materials, spurring a shift from wood to brick and stone in new construction. Chicago's population grew from about 324,000 before the fire to nearly 1 million by 1890. In the following decades, Chicago became a center of architectural innovation, giving rise to some of the world's first modern skyscrapers. Despite the horror of 1871, the Great Chicago Fire forged an enduring legacy of resilience. Its memory is woven into the city's identity, and one of the 4 stars on Chicago's flag commemorates the fire. The cow story may have become folklore around the nation and internationally, but in a 1997 twist, the city officially exonerated Catherine O'Leary and her cow from blame.